It's time to rip the cover off what really works to ditch addiction, depression, anger, anxiety, and all other kinds of human suffering. No, not sobriety. We're talking the F word here, freedom. We'll share straight from the trenches what we've learned from leaving our own addictions behind and coaching hundreds of others to do the same. And since it's such a heavy topic, we might as well have a good time while we're at it. All right, welcome back, guys. It is now on to adventure number 4. After, I hope nobody was offended last week after ending on my Chinese voice, because I will do it again if you ask. So this week, we're going to step into the chapter where this is where I was very conscious of writing this book of how much I am throwing a very massive argument that contradicts a lot of what the psychology industry kind of does, and not everything. You know, a lot of psychologists, a lot of therapists, a lot of people that we've worked with them. They've come to us for help, and they agree with a lot of what's there. But the industry at large still holds a position that is quite contrary to what we're doing here. And so I had to build a case for something that we covered at length on this podcast, which is that there is no such thing as addiction as it is commonly understood. And so we cover a lot of territory on this. I don't want to rehash some of the things. You can listen to a ton of it over the past couple of years, but there are going to be some salient points that come up. I thought it would be cool to start with the poem. It's a short poem, but I feel like the poem sums up the entire adventure. And so I'm going to do that because I can. Okay, the title of the poem is Just One. A single lie believed true will ruin all the life in you. How will you know the difference? I'm not going to give my name and date. I do that in the book, though, just in case you wanted to know my name every chapter. But that's what we're really dealing with in this chapter is a single lie. And by lie, I don't necessarily mean a malicious lie. I mean just something that does not correspond to what's maybe actually going on, as far as we can tell. I mean an addition to observed data that interprets it and then spins it in a certain direction. We didn't do the little singing bowl gong with the poem, so you'll have to listen to the book for that. But yes. So, and then we dive into all the stuff. So I don't know if you have specific questions, Lee.
Yeah, I think it's important to say this isn't just your opinion. That you quote respected psychiatrist Thomas Inzel, who was also the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. He said, "You don't understand how broken our field is, that we don't have good tools, that we're not healing people. We're helping with symptoms at best, and that we're desperate for new tools." It reminds me of the Emperor's New Clothes.
Okay.
Like it's very obvious to people in the industry that this isn't working in a large degree. And
right.
People are coming back, and we've talked about therapists that we know that, you know, the actual industry of therapy is making money off of bringing people back, not actually healing them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, and so it's a broken system, and yes, it's helping, and yes, I was in it, and yes, I was helped by it, and it also kept me there.
Yes.
Michael Pollan talks about this too with the studies around psychedelics and things. It's just
right.
that like one reason why there is such an interest in that, and it's just because the tools that are currently available with SSRIs and stuff are just like not that great. They
right.
like don't beat placebo.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And I think that does speak to the integrity of the industry wanting to find answers. You know, that does speak to people wanting to find answers, and many of them are still going down trodden paths, hoping to just make those answers better. You know, there's the electroshock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy that's being used still, and there are people still exploring it at deeper and deeper levels and trying to evolve it into something that can help. And so there's a whole host of people that are trying to make the old answers work better. There are people going out and exploring new answers, which would be me. I'm just not inside the industry. And so to try and make a compelling case for this without having the credentials of someone like Jordan Peterson or the background of some of these researchers and whatnot, well, I did my best.
I really respect that this, again, I'll say is this isn't your opinion. Like you go back and show us the origins of the idea of addiction and addict us and where that all came from. But then also in relatively recent history, within the last 150 years, where the modern idea of addiction comes from and how it's ridiculous. and yet it has gone unchallenged. And here we are, 130 years later, dealing with the ramifications of all that.
Yeah, based on some propaganda. And whether or not the people believed in their what was dubbed quack medicine at the time, it's the propaganda that sticks. The right commercial jingle. You guys remember your commercials from a kid? The ones like the Listerine. Do you remember the Listerine commercial with the guy swinging? The Listerine bottle swinging through. Maybe you're too young for that. Oh, dang. Oh, dang. Anyway, like there are certain, little jingles and little things that they stick in your head, and they get to the public, and the public doesn't, they're not in the industry. It's like academics, talking about things. There are academic biblical scholars that are uncovering things that massively contradict everything that the public at large knows, but it just hasn't leaked to the public yet in a way that they could, remember it, or that it would go viral. And so the same thing here with the psychology industry in this case. And here we have stories of addiction as a word that at first was just like a word to describe something that people were really invested in, both good and bad, but then it became negative, and then it became like an idea that a founding father decided was, had some stuff going on with it, and then some other doctor decided that it's a disease after we tried the whole demonic approach, and maybe addiction comes from demons, and then the people wanted some freedom from that. So it was an idea that landed at the right time with a hungry populace, and it just kind of got sucked in as the disease model of addiction. The disease model of addiction's around all over the place. There are a number of really respected researchers and therapists and psychiatrists and stuff that have been trying to fight it for decades. You got Stanton Peele doing his work on it, and he's been at it for like 50 or 60 years. You have Bruce Alexander, who's talking about it with his Rat Park experiments. And you have a lot of experimentation all along the way that gets sidelined or whatnot and not mainstreamed because the idea landed at a time when people wanted the idea.
And it seems to me, or at least it was to me, like an attractive lie. Like, oh, it's a chemical imbalance, or it's I can.
Dude, I bought the lie.
Yeah.
Like I really did. When we went to the 12-step programs, the 12-step programs were saying it was a character flaw, but the people in there were talking about the disease.
Yeah.
It's like, no, it's a disease.
It's a relief to hear that. It was for me.
It was for me too, because I was like, oh, thank you. Anyway, so it was a huge relief. So I bought into it for a period of time while I was there in the 12-step programs. And I think you're right to say it was a very attractive lie, and not a malicious one, just an add-on to what the observed data actually indicated. And the people that were doing it, the surprising part is the people that were doing it got results, which we talk about later in the book in terms of placebo. Like they did get results, and they also didn't get results. But by the time that anybody was really looking at the data, it was already too far gone. And the same thing happened with 12-step programs. Prohibition ends. There's a lot of alcoholics around. There aren't any recovery programs. And this one shows up, and it does help people at least find some sense of control and some sense of understanding or direction or meaning behind it, instead of just being dogged by this amorphous blob thing called addiction that's controlling everything. And so it landed, and then by the mid-1900s, it became like standard fare in terms of commonly sending people to 12-step programs for recovery. So we decided we would add an awkward pause in here just because everybody's nodding, but you guys can't see that we're nodding. So there's that.
I don't know. I think I'm taking just a little bit of time to process in my own experience, especially having gone through a lot of the therapy approach and 12-step. I remember working with a marriage and family therapist, and it was a fun experience because I got to go in and again talked about like being comfortable and sitting there and having these conversations. And I remember specifically around pornography, she just looked at me one day and she's like, I can't help. I can't help with this. And by the way, this network of therapists that I work with in this area also really don't have a clue of like what to do to help with this specific thing. She's like, we can look at some of the symptoms of this behavior, not looking at that behavior as a symptom itself. But like, that's the best we can do. So maybe let's explore the anger issues that you have and let's explore some of these pieces. And so it was just like, okay, one, you haven't dealt with this. And that was a huge thing for me. And two, like you're telling me that in this area that I live, like there's not really anyone that is going to be able to help me with this. And so that's where I really started to question the industry and to look at, like, is this the best way to approach this? And, it wasn't just marriage and family therapists, it was psychologists and psychiatrists, it was medication, because, well, if you're dealing with pornography and we can't figure out another way to handle this, and, in the big book of psychological disorders, this actually isn't definable as an addiction, but we're still going to try to medicate you for this to see if that'll help. And it was just a gamble. It was just like a gamble with my life, with my health, with my relationships, with my chemical state. And so starting to ask those questions, like, is this the best way to approach this? And so this chapter is kind of diving into the idea of addiction, for me, redefining what the problem was. And for me, it's like porn is the problem. And then all of a sudden, when I found Bob and we're starting to look at things, like, porn isn't the problem. It's also another symptom. A symptom of what? Something underneath that, was created because of past experiences, my outlook on life. Like, let's really look at what's underneath this behavior, this pattern of thinking and engaging with the world. And that was powerful because it was a different way of looking at something that, for as long as I can remember, was both not an addiction, but also an addiction, and just so much confusion around what the best approach was. And so, Bob, I guess that'd be kind of a question is, obviously with this chapter, you kind of go back to the history and the idea of addiction, but when was it for you personally where you just challenged the idea that addiction, as most people define it, isn't actually a thing?
Yeah, I think I had an advantage in this arena because I was such a word nerd that I commonly went to etymology for everything to try and figure out, like, where did this word come from? What did it originally mean? And I used to do it as a kid, like a nerd. Like, the word nauseous originally meant that thing that is nauseous makes me feel nausea. So when people would wander around being like, man, I feel nauseous, I go, yeah, you do. Hey. Nauseated would be the correct word. But of course, dictionaries change over time. And now nauseous just means I feel nausea. So I was the word nerd that way. And so I think that helped. And so when I had, and I mention it in this chapter, I think, where me having this vision of myself at 90 years old, and I hadn't gotten out of addiction. It happened in this flash. And I was like, wow, I just spent 60 years doing nothing but fighting with willpower for a long time and trying not to relapse. And that's my life. I was like, I can't do that. And so among all the other stuff I tried, one of the things was to ask the question, what if that's not actually the issue? Because everybody else was saying it was lifelong, but I was like, and at the time, very religiously oriented, I was like, if Jesus can raise the dead, but he can't handle addiction, that seems like a weird beta version of Jesus. Like, he seems to have some odd limitations of powers, like he's playing with a handicap just so the other players feel like they have a shot or something like that. And I was like, this isn't. So I was like, if I really believe that there is this all powerful being out there,
my Jesus is an alpha.
Yours is an alpha version. Wait, is that before or after beta?
Alpha and omega, I guess.
Which the Hebrews would say Aleph and Tav, right? And so there you go.
If you say so.
They do. Yeah. Because the Tav would be the last letter in the alphabet. So I went and I asked that question. And I think it was a really honest and sincere-hearted question. I didn't mean it to be flippant in any way, but I was like, if I really believe this thing, then let's put it to the test. And so that's where I was like, well, what if this is? And then I looked up the word addiction. I was like, the addiction as a word just means to say yes to something. Then in the history of it, oh, wow, the first addicts were actually religious people, people who had given their lives over to something that they were devoted to. And then eventually over time, the word came to mean this other thing. And so I was like, okay, cool. So if addiction's a thing, what if it's not actually a molecule? Like, a disease was a bacteria, a virus in my mind. And yeah, mental health diseases aside, at the time I hadn't really challenged all of those yet, but I was like, it's not actually a thing. Like, nobody has ever, like, in any laboratory anywhere isolated, oh, we found a molecule of addiction floating through your blood. So lucky we caught it early, because if it had metastasized and grown, then you would have been a full-blown addict here in 10 years or something like that. It wasn't anything like that. And so that's where I was like, oh, if this isn't real, then what's actually going on? And that's where I had to boil back down into my own experience.
Right. And I think like initially hearing that for me, like this idea, like addiction isn't real, challenged some things in me, because I think both like you said, Bob and Jeff, like there was some level of comfort in sitting in a 12-step meeting, like, oh, I'm an addict and I have this disease. I have this thing. Because when it's like, well, maybe then there's a possibility like with other diseases and illnesses that I can take medication, I can pop a pill and it will fix this thing. And I really tried that for a long time, like a lot of different freaking medications to try and handle this porn thing. And I think a point of clarification too, when I worked with that marriage and family therapist and she's like, there's no one up here that can help with this, there were plenty that were trying.
Yeah.
And there were a lot that were trying. And her point was that no one is consistently having success. And so it was like redefining, and that's what I, challenge you, the listener, as you're reading this book, if you're looking at this chapter and it's bringing up even fear or doubt or like even like anger, like, yes, addiction is a thing. Like, look at that and look at the way you're defining this concept, this word in your own life, and kind of ask yourself, like, how is defining it in this way making anything better?
So now let's take the word disease and flip it on its head. The word disease is made of two words, or two parts, right? We have dis, which would be you dissing me? No, this would be, it's a prefix from Latin, I'm pretty sure. It means to insult. No, I'm kidding. Which was like a transformation of the prefix, meaning the DE prefix, like down from, or that which comes down from, and then ease. So somebody who's experiencing dis-ease, or they're ill at ease. And so if we flip that on its head and we look at it, that's what I went back to look at. I was like, okay, cool. What's happening? Well, the only things that I know happening are I'm uncomfortable here, or I'm breathing weird here, or my eyes are darting one way or another. And so that's where I introduce in this chapter emotional ninjutsu, which is something that as a reader, if you're going through it, you can really kind of dive in and look at the ABLE of that. It's what I end the chapter with for that.
The funny thing about this to me is like the way you talk about addiction isn't real. You're saying like it's not a physical thing. It's not the disease model. It makes you think, oh, it's a molecule or some sort of thing. Like, that's not true. And then what you end up with is
a physical thing.
Yeah. But it's totally different. Yeah. It's just like, yeah, I don't know. It's weird.
It's strange. But I think, we've been around, and Jeff and I have had a lot of talk. Jeff has this level of attention to the kind of like detail and the ramifications of the things I say that he'll bring up all the time. Like, this feels contradictory. And I go, yep, but it works.
So I was thinking about this last night while I was doing the darkness meditation a little bit. But I feel like arguing with you is consistent with everything that you are. It's like sparring with you. It's like you do the like thing with words and with ideas. It's like I can't grab onto this guy. He started tickling me. Like now he's just making random noises instead of like laying down a philosophical argument, which is like, oh, of course he's doing that.
And that makes it so that addiction doesn't land. Yeah. In case you didn't know, is a technical term for a martial arts move that we will make up later.
Yeah.
But
if you or someone you know is looking to drop the F-bomb of freedom in their life, whether that's from past trauma, depression, anxiety, addiction, or any other host of emotional and personal struggles, but they just don't know how or want some help doing it, head on over to thefreedomspecialist.com/feelbetternow and check out some of the things we've got in store for you, or book a call so we can look at your unique situation and get you the help that you're looking for.
The other thing about Bob is that he gets a lot of his wisdom from Kung Fu Panda. So that's what that is.
There are people listening to this that actually believe that, and that's just not true. There may be some borrowed phrases and instances, but
all right. I'm pretty sure Kung Fu Panda got it from me.
Yeah.
Just kidding. Okay, so emotional ninjutsu, which is what ends the chapter. I mean, you've dived into this a lot, Jeff, right? And you as well, like all three of you in some way. I just share my kind of like one example of how I kind of do it in a weird, hokey way so that you guys can imagine me doing snow angels on the carpet so that it's somewhat of an entertaining. There's a lot of different ways that I've done it over the years, some more challenging, some less. But when it comes to it, it's a simple acronym that actually my oldest son helped me create, because I was like, how do I put this into something that will be memorable? Let's make an acronym. Because of course my dad was in the military and they have acronyms all over the place. Welcome to the land of ridiculous acronyms, basically, is what you enter into when you start doing some of the stuff that we're doing. And ABLE, which was a way of me saying, look, the first thing that you have to do in order to be able to get out of this dis-ease, any of these mental health issues, is to be able to acknowledge what's there. Meaning you have to be able to see it. Because if you can't see it, I mean, feel it, be aware of it in some way, then it's just going to own you until you can figure it out. Then to start to breathe, which is a kind of loosening on the inside. It also changes your chemistry. Then there's loosen, the L itself, which has to do with movement and relaxing tension in the system. And then there was escape, which is a postural thing. So these elements here, breath, movement, relaxation, and posture or structure, are elements that when you start to toggle these, now you actually have the ability to turn up and down the volume on the problems that you have. And then that allows you some freedom to realize, wow, okay, cool. Emotion can now be an adventure instead of just struggle all the time. So for you guys, as you've dived into that particularly, like, what did it do for you?
The way I think of it is like that preventative maintenance piece. Like when I can't, like I used to work with these big hydraulic presses where we would make pottery, and they would break down all the time because we didn't really know how to use them. And we have to have the guys who built them come down from Ohio and like fix them and replace parts and stuff. And then they finally like taught us, like, you know, every week you need to do this oiling, you need to take this piece out, clean it like that. And so that's what I think of when I came to the first retreat. It was like, oh, my body is breaking down and I'm needing to do all these really intense things. And so we had this big like refitting, you know, doing all this really intense, deep physical work. And then the able stuff is like, okay, now when I go back into my life, I'm taking the same stuff that we're doing at the retreats, changing my posture, doing stuff with my breath, but in just these like micro everyday ways so that the stuff doesn't build up. So, I mean, similar. I mean, I have 2 kids and a wife, and that is just like something that I would build up a ton of tension around all that stuff. And now it's something that I can do in conversations with my wife, especially, where I feel the tension starting to increase. And then I think my old pattern would be to, okay, let's talk about this. Let's figure it out. Let's, believe the right thing. Let's communicate better and start with that stuff. And now that stuff comes much more easily. I communicate way better with Rebecca, and she communicate, like, we understand each other way more, but not because we've worked on our communication explicitly. That's like a byproduct of these physical and minute, sometimes really, like, just moving from sitting up, leaning forward to leaning back, doing that with intention. It changes the whole conversation. And I feel like what you alluded to kind of there, the buildup, Jeff, was like significant for me, because when I started practicing ABLE in the beginning, it was each step very intentionally, ABLE, and spending time in each of those. And then as it progressed, sometimes I didn't want to acknowledge. I didn't need to. I didn't need to create a story around what was happening. Not that that's what acknowledge did, but then there were times where I'd get locked into, like, I'm acknowledging, what's happened, and then I'm also going to try and understand why. So the quicker that I was able to move from A to B was really significant. Then eventually got to the point where I could feel the tension without any context and breathe. And then that would clear out or lighten the system, my body, the escape postural stuff. So sometimes it wasn't breathing. Sometimes it was just, I need to sit up in my chair. I need to not be hunched over, because clearly, rounding my shoulders with my chin to my chest is actually creating physiological depression and emotional depression. And so I'm just going to lift my freaking head up and feel better. And so
it was a progression of like, it's laid out this way. And so I did it that way. And then I didn't always have to do it exactly that way, but I could take a piece. And it honestly was just situational. What do I need in this situation? But even before, I think right before we started filming this podcast, it's a question in my mind, like, why do people just suddenly become maniacs? And in my mind, it's oversimplification, but it's because they don't handle their crap when it comes up. They allow the buildup and build up over time, whether that's build up from morning to evening and then I'm exploding and erupting on my family, or build up through the week. I've gone through my week. And I remember having conversations with clients early on talking about redlining. You go to work on Monday and your boss yells at you. You drive home in the evening and someone cuts you off. The next day you get in an argument with your spouse or your kids are driving you crazy. Wednesday, your car breaks down. By Thursday, Friday, you've had all of this buildup. And if you haven't looked at each of those situations on their own and processed them, which Abel is really effective for doing, then you're redlining by Friday and wondering why you've just exploded on everyone around you. And so I think that for me was like really powerful of like, I'm going to not allow the buildup, and Abel really effectively and simply made that possible to where, like Jeff said, I benefited from coming to retreats because then I could handle some of the big stuff, but now there's just less big stuff because I'm handling the small stuff as it comes up.
And I think when I first was going through the online stuff before I ever came to a retreat, I learned this and it seems so trite. Like, it's just like, no, this is not, the problem is not that I'm not breathing. The problem is that I have this broken marriage or this that the way that I was raised or that sort of things. And then at the retreat, doing something like a cold plunge and doing it at first without having any control of my breath, and then getting some coaching in that and getting control of my breath is like night and day, the experience of it. So it was like that. So I think that was a huge thing for me in the beginning of just this like proof of concept of just like, oh, what if there is something as simple as my posture and my breathing? And if I can start to build those muscles of being aware of that stuff and then changing it, then my perception can change. What seems important to me in a situation can drastically change in a second.
I think Abel has come to me very much like what Tucker was talking about. It was almost more rudimentary and clumsy, and it is happening more automatically all the time. And some of that is due to the online stuff where, Bob, you had to, set an alarm on our phone and just stop and say, what's going on, and that was huge for me to be able to automatically, almost subconsciously now take a survey and say, what's actually happening right now. And so there's been a lot going into that where I don't go step by step necessarily. I may skip some steps, but I'm like, oh, my shoulders are forward. Like I gotta, shake my shoulders out and take, some people call it cleansing breath, and just like, wow, that was interesting, and let's go, and just the ability to move on from there. Where I have seen it personally in my life is using the idea of Abel in spaces and with groups of people. The acknowledging like, hey, something's happening in this space. Let me open the windows. Let me open the curtains. Let's move the furniture around. Let's get people out of this space and into a new space, and let's change it so that we can start on a new foundation and have a fresh start. And have seen that work itself out that way. So there's that. That's Abel. But can we go back to this chapter and this is a conversation that we've had throughout this whole book, is that like I've come from the part of the what I've done in the past is the rescue mission industry. We're working with homeless and addicts, and we have detox rooms where they're padded and they're locked in for 10 hours until they come off of their, they do their recovery and come out, they come down, and so like I've said to you, like, what are we saying to the person who's standing outside the door with the key, watching this guy go pull out of addiction, come out of that process? Because we can, they can say, well, yeah, that may all be true about where the word addictus comes from. And that may be true about the guy who had the chloride and put the gold in it. And that may all be true of that. But if I'm speaking as that worker saying, I stand at that drunk tank every night and watch a guy come out of that.
Yeah. So And I think we cover this some in chapter 5, where we're really looking at are substances addictive in that 5th adventure. But, the question for them, they're very real observations. I've gotten angry emails from nurses and people who have been in ERs and stuff and watching people, and they're saying, like, you're doing a massive disservice to the world. You're just gaslighting people. You're doing all this other stuff, to which I would level the same accusation their direction. You're just gaslighting them into telling them there's something going on that isn't going on. They think they see addiction. What they do see is a chemical reaction to the environment, to the substances put in. Yeah, if you put like too much air into somebody, like too much oxygen, a person can go through all kinds of problems. Too much carbon dioxide, all kinds of problems. Fear will come up. Like just pumping carbon dioxide in a higher mixture in the air will cause a chemical reaction. And that will cause a cascade chain of effects in the body to try and recover from or manage that reaction, which shows up as fear. This is James Nestor talks about that in the book Breath, right? And so like just those do happen. There is something that's going on. So we don't have to take that away from that person, that worker. What we do want to take away is the lie built on top of it. All of the extra conclusions being made above the observation. It is very real that person who is like drinking a lot of alcohol, some of them can die from the cascade chain of chemical reactions that happen. And if that's not mitigated well, that's a problem. But that's not the same thing as addiction. The chemical dependence is not a real thing. Chemical reactions are very observable. Chemical dependence is a theory about what's happening used in an attempt to predict future actions. And it's been a useful theory because, okay, if this guy has an addiction, the prediction that I can make out of this theory of addiction is that he will return to it, or he will get quote unquote triggered, or something else will happen. And then he'll go down the rails because that's what's happened before. So a theory is used in order to predict things. Theories are proven wrong all the time. That doesn't make them not useful even. Newtonian physics does not work at a quantum level, but it's still useful within a range of parameters. So we can say the theory is useful for helping predict behavior. But in terms of what's really going on, that theory includes that behavior will never go away, which is a faulty prediction. There are people who don't do any of the stuff we're doing, and they just kind of are done. They walk away from their problem. They're just like, yeah, I just quit it cold turkey. I talk to them all the time because something in them changed.
And that includes people using drugs and alcohol, not just some.
Yeah, people come to me for like porn, and they're like, yeah, I've quit heroin and I quit meth and I quit all of these other things. They just walked away from it, just like that. And so to say that, well, it's addiction that's at play here, there's some phantom thing that's addiction, is well-intended, but a poorly aimed theory when it comes to, well, let's actually make a change as opposed to mitigate circumstances.
In the chapter, you talk about Mr. Right, which I think is a fascinating story. And I've certainly had moments in my own life where I thought I had something and then, have made myself sick. But speak to Mr. Right a little bit.
Yeah. So in order to kind of drive the point home, I went away from addiction and I went straight to cancer, right? Because there's not anybody on the planet that's going to argue that cancer isn't a real thing, right? And Mr. Right is a story. Part of his story is very well known in some like TED Talks and some other circles, where he's somebody who was in the last stages of lymphosarcoma. He had 2 weeks to live, and he was admitted into a trial study for a wonder drug called Krebiosin, which was supposedly going to be the new thing that could cure cancer. And he was given his first dose, and the next week, the doctor thought he was going to be dead, but he was like miracle. Like all these huge, like baseball-sized tumors had shrunk. All the fluid that they were taking out of his chest, like it started going away. Within like a handful of days, he was released from the hospital, sent home to his life, perfect bill of health. And then a newspaper article comes around that says, hey, this is not actually an effective drug at all. All the trials have come back negative. Even all the other people in the same hospital that were in the trials with him, all the other 11, and they did it with a number of hospitals, all those other ones, nobody got any better. And so the doctor decided to test this with his own like quack medicine. And he was like, how is it that all these other quack medicine doctors get this? So he told him, no, that was just a bad batch. We're going to get a better batch. And then in he comes he came in with just water. That's all it was. It was a saline solution. It might have been salt water. I can't remember exactly the solution at the moment. It was basically water. And let the guy work himself up about it, injected water into the guy within a couple days, faster than the first time. All those tumors that had reappeared now disappeared again. And the man went off with a clean bill of health. And then finally, there was a final result report about the drug, and all the tumors came back, and then the man died. And so we were watching this change from disease to health, not addiction to health, not, he's going through withdrawals now. This was like literally tumors, and then shifting back to health just by virtue of this man's belief in a reality that wasn't necessarily the case. And then the shattering of that belief in that reality, and then the reinstatement of that belief, and then the shattering of it again until finally the life ebbed from his, I was going to say some gruesome thing about his corpse, but maybe I should be, respectful to the dead. So, and that happened. Now, that as a corollary to the single greatest factor in determining whether or not a person will experience withdrawals is their belief that they will. Even the people that come into these places that have no narcotics in their system but are having withdrawals because they got some cheapo knockoff version that wasn't actually the thing they were after, and they're having withdrawal symptoms because they believe that they will. So to wrap up, like what we're talking about in this chapter, and I know that's all is heavy hitting, and we've kind of gone around the block a little bit on this one. This was one to redirect the entire, to sidestep the theory for a second. Not that it's not useful. It is useful. Theories are useful, in all kinds of different ways. But to sidestep the theory of addiction, because that theory also includes the incapacity to ever be free of it. It includes that it can be passed along nowadays. It includes that it can be inherited. And now my father was an alcoholic, so I'll be an alcoholic. It includes lifetimes of conditioning. And if we sidestep the theory and go back to the drawing board and go, what's a new theory? Boom, you got people like Max Planck who come up with quantum mechanics. And now because of him, we have supercomputers and all kinds of other stuff. Just because somebody decided to sidestep the theory because it wasn't matching the data. And we'll talk about him in another chapter. It might be the next one, actually. And so that's my lead in to next week. This week, folks, as we sign off, just consider that. What other theories do you have about things in your life that are really big struggles? What if you're wrong? What if it's been useful as a theory and you don't have to necessarily chuck it? But if you want to be done with it, or if you want a new solution or a new result, instead of doing the insane way and repeating what you're doing, hoping for a different result, you actually change the approach and see something new. And that's all that I did. And emotional ninjutsu came out of that, among so many other things. The final and most important question for this podcast is this. When doing emotional ninjutsu, do you feel like a ninja?
So sorry.
Oh, come on.
And that's it for today's Alive and Free podcast. If you enjoyed this show and want some more freedom bombs landing in your earbuds, subscribe right now at wherever you get your podcasts from. And while you're at it, give us a rating and a review. It'll help us keep delivering great stuff to you. Plus, it's just nice to be nice.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.